They thought they were making a statement, bold, artistic, maybe even timeless. But by the time the credits rolled, the headlines weren't about the performances, they were about the fallout. In the 70s and 80s, a wave of daring cinema swept through Europe and Hollywood. Some of it was celebrated as fearless, some dismissed as glorified scandal. But for the actors at the center of it all, the price of pushing boundaries came fast and hit hard. From controversial cult hits like Caligula and 9.5 Weeks, to the sensual shadows of Emmanuelle and Lady Chatterley's Lover, these were roles that promised freedom and nearly closed every door that followed. This is the story of films that blurred the line between courage and controversy, and the careers that never fully recovered. When Caligula was first announced, it didn't sound like controversy. It sounded like Oscar bait, a historical epic set in ancient Rome, backed by an all-star cast that included Malcolm McDowell, Helen Mirren, Peter O'Toole, and John Gielgud. On paper, it looked like the kind of film that would earn standing ovations, not censorship bans. But what started as a prestige project quickly spiraled into something far more chaotic and unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Behind the scenes, Caligula became a battleground of creative control. The film's producer, Bob Guccione, best known as the founder of Penthouse magazine, had a very different vision from the actors and original screenwriter. What was supposed to be provocative and intellectual turned into something far more explicit. Entire scenes were rewritten, reshot, and, most controversially, enhanced with unsimulated sexual acts inserted during post-production without the actors' consent. Malcolm McDowell, who played the title role of the Roman emperor, would later say he had never agreed to the final version of the film. He described watching the premiere as a shocking experience, seeing a film he barely recognized. Helen Mirren, at the time a respected and rising stage actress, took the role partly out of curiosity and partly because, in her own words, it was about Roman decadence, and I thought, why not? Later, she called the final result an experiment that got hijacked. The critical response was vicious. Many reviewers couldn't even make it through the entire film. It was labeled incoherent, exploitative, and borderline pornographic. Some countries banned it outright. Even among liberal cinephiles, Caligula was seen as having crossed a line, not because it was bold, but because it was blunt. The reputational fallout hit hard. Actors who had built careers on craft and nuance suddenly found themselves caught in the middle of a cinematic firestorm. Their performances, no matter how strong, were overshadowed by the controversy. Instead of being remembered for its ambition, Caligula became infamous for its excesses. For a long time, it was the kind of movie no one talked about in polite company. The kind of role you didn't list on your resume unless you had to. A scarlet letter for actors who were aiming for awards, and ended up in something closer to cult infamy. It was meant to provoke serious conversation about power, corruption, and madness. But in the end, Caligula became a lesson in what happens when ambition collides with exploitation, and art gets lost somewhere in between. When Emmanuelle hit French cinemas in 1974, it didn't scream controversy. It whispered it through soft lighting, exotic settings, and a dreamlike tone that felt more poetic than provocative. It didn't shock the audience, it seduced them. What started as a quiet, sensual film ended up becoming a global phenomenon, especially across Europe, where it was seen not as scandalous, but liberated. And at the center of it all was a young Dutch actress named Sylvia Kristel. For Kristel, Emmanuelle was supposed to be her breakout, a stepping stone into international cinema, and in some ways it was. The film shattered box office records, ran in theaters for years, and turned her into a household name overnight. But with that fame came a price. The role she played, passive, mysterious, eternally nude, began to blend into her public persona. Emmanuelle wasn't just a character, she became an identity, and Sylvia Kristel couldn't shake it. She went on to reprise the role in multiple sequels, each one sliding further away from artistry and closer to exploitation. Directors stopped seeing her as an actress with range. They saw the silhouette, the allure, the brand. Offers poured in, but they all asked for more of the same and less of her. In her later years, Kristel spoke candidly about how the role followed her. In her autobiography, she wrote with heartbreaking clarity, "I was Emmanuelle, and Emmanuelle was me. But after a while, I didn't know where she ended and I began." She wasn't publicly shamed. There were no angry editorials, no boycotts, but she was quietly placed in a box, one she never quite managed to escape from. A career that could have taken many different paths was slowly funneled into just one. And while the film gained cult status, referenced, rewatched, reimagined, the woman who gave it life found her creative world shrinking. Emmanuelle opened every door, but it also quietly locked her inside. After Emmanuelle, Sylvia Kristel was ready for something different. She had become a symbol, iconic, yes, but also trapped in a single kind of role. What she needed was a shift, a project that would show the world she could be more than a fantasy. Enter Lady Chatterley's Lover, a film based on D.H. Lawrence's infamous novel, once banned for its explicit content. But this wasn't just about sex. The book dealt with class, longing, emotional repression, and the human need for connection. It had literary weight, depth, prestige, at least that was the idea. On paper, it seemed like the perfect move, a provocative story, but one with gravitas. A chance to blend sensuality with seriousness. Kristel hoped it would redefine her, a more mature, artistic image. But when the film was released, the reality was far murkier. Instead of elevating her career, Lady Chatterley's Lover doubled down on the image she was trying to shake. The film leaned heavily into eroticism, long, lingering scenes, sparse dialogue, and soft-focus intimacy. Critics weren't kind. Some accused it of hiding behind literary credentials while doing the same thing Emmanuelle had done, selling sex just with better costumes. For Kristel, it was another dead end. The industry saw the film and confirmed what they already believed. She was uncastable outside of sensual roles. It didn't matter that Lady Chatterley's Lover was based on classic literature. It didn't matter that she approached it with seriousness and subtlety. What audiences remembered were the scenes, not the story. The nudity, not the nuance. She had stepped into the role hoping for reinvention. What she got was reinforcement. Another stamp on a public image that had become almost impossible to rewrite. Once again, her talent was reduced to a single dimension, and serious filmmakers stopped calling. In 1973, Italian cinema unveiled Malizia, a film that would define an era and reshape the life of its star. Framed as a playful domestic comedy, it flirted with taboo, danced around desire, and captured audiences with its provocative charm. But what truly captivated the public wasn't the storyline. It was Laura Antonelli. Though already a working actress, Malizia elevated her to something far more intense, a national obsession. She portrayed Angela, a housekeeper entering the home of a widowed man and his adolescent son. What could have been a one-dimensional fantasy became something else in her hands. Controlled, restrained, magnetic. Her performance hinted at more than it revealed, and that was part of its power. The film became a box office phenomenon, and Antonelli was at the center of its storm. But as the applause grew louder, the perception of her narrowed. She became inseparable from the image on screen. Alluring, enigmatic, unreachable. From that point on, the industry no longer saw the actress, they saw the idea. Roles that followed were strikingly similar, carefully crafted to echo Malizia without room for evolution. Antonelli longed to explore dramatic cinema, to challenge herself, but the opportunities rarely came. The persona the world had attached to her was too enduring, too profitable to let go. In the years that followed, her story took another turn. Legal troubles, personal struggles, constant intrusion from a media more interested in spectacle than truth. The woman once hailed as a symbol of elegance and temptation slowly faded from public view. Looking back, Malizia was both a breakthrough and a boundary. It granted her visibility, but not versatility. Immortality, but not control. It gave her a place in cinematic history, but it also built the cage she'd spend the rest of her career trying to step out of. By the mid-1980s, Hollywood was starting to dip its toes into more provocative waters. The era of bold, stylish eroticism had arrived, or so it seemed, and 9.5 Weeks was poised to ride that wave. With Kim Basinger and Mickey Rourke, two rising stars, leading the charge, and Flashdance director Adrian Lyne behind the camera, expectations were sky high. The film promised a seductive exploration of power, control, and emotional unraveling. It was marketed as art, polished, psychological, daring. But what audiences got was something else entirely. When 9.5 Weeks premiered at film festivals, reactions were immediate and severe. Walkouts, silence, a sense of discomfort that wasn't just about the explicit content, but the emotional rawness that underpinned it. Many American theaters refused to screen it altogether. The US box office barely flickered. Critics didn't hold back. They called it sleazy, hollow, style without soul. The film's intimacy was too real, too vulnerable, and not what American audiences expected from their stars. Kim Basinger later revealed that the shoot itself was emotionally grueling. The boundaries between acting and actual psychological strain blurred, and not always in a healthy way. For Mickey Rourke, the role amplified his intensity, but not necessarily in a flattering way. The backlash in the US was swift and personal. Basinger's image suffered. Rourke, once hailed as the next Brando, was suddenly labeled difficult, volatile. Ironically, the film exploded overseas. In Europe, 9.5 Weeks was embraced, not just as erotic, but as avant-garde. VHS sales soared. It became the kind of movie people watched in secret and talked about in whispers. But in Hollywood, the damage had been done. What was meant to be a daring leap forward became a cultural dividing line, one that neither star crossed easily again. The film promised sophistication and depth, but it left behind a trail of uncomfortable questions and reputational wounds. Instead of elevating its stars, 9.5 Weeks became a cinematic paradox, too sexy for Hollywood, too smart for softcore, and too intense to forget. From the moment it was announced, the story of O carried the weight of controversy. The novel it was based on had already been banned in multiple countries, accused of romanticizing submission and erotic control. It was whispered about, judged, misunderstood, and bringing it to the screen, that was a storm waiting to happen. In 1975, French actress Corinne Cléry stepped into the lead role, a woman known only as O, who willingly surrenders herself to a world of domination, identity loss, and extreme emotional exposure. The story was intended to be philosophical, symbolic, a deep dive into the nature of love, power, and autonomy. But by the time the film reached audiences, much of that meaning had been stripped away, or simply ignored. What viewers saw was graphic, uncompromising, visually intense in a way that stunned even the most open-minded of cinephiles. Censors cracked down, critics recoiled. The film was banned in several countries, and when it wasn't banned, it was buried under accusations of exploitation disguised as art. Cléry's performance didn't go unnoticed. In some circles, she was praised for her bravery, for committing to a role that demanded total vulnerability. But those accolades came with a shadow. Like Sylvia Crystal and Laura Antonelli before her, Cléry found that a single provocative role could eclipse everything else. The character of O, stripped down in every sense, became the image that followed her everywhere. She continued acting, often in genre films or supporting roles. But the story of O was always there, trailing her like a ghost. Not because it was her greatest performance, but because it was the one people couldn't stop looking at. What was meant to be artistic became personal. What was meant to challenge societal norms ended up boxing her into one. It was bold, it was fearless, but it was also irreversible. In the end, the story of O became exactly what its title suggests. Not just a tale of submission, but a story impossible to escape from.